I will say that there is a lot of freedom in owning what you run and just feeling like that. I think it's like a high agency culture, and you feel a good degree of control over what you're putting out. Um, but one of the reasons they're able to get the permission to kind of break this off and run it more like a modern team is because they get business buy-in. Hey there, welcome to Book Overflow. This is the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toops. How are you doing, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey, everybody.
Well, we are excited for the episode we have prepared for you today. We're going to be diving into part 2 of the Unicorn Project by Gene Kim. We'll get to that in just a sec. I just want to let you guys know, as always, if you're on YouTube, like, comment, subscribe. We had some great YouTube comments lately, some real good deep thinking going on in the comments section. So, we always love hearing your thoughts, and we try to respond whenever we can. And we'd also want you to check out our interview with Martin Fowler on refactoring. This was a really cool opportunity, wasn't it, Nathan?
Yeah, this was great. It's one of those bucket list items. We got to there's a little bit of back and forth to try to get him on the podcast, and now we've got him, and it was a fascinating conversation. I think you're gonna really get a kick out of it.
Yeah, most authors we've been pleasantly surprised have been pretty willing and eager to come on the podcast. Martin Fowler was one we'd reached out to a long time ago, and he said, well, I'm a busy man, and I'm picky about the kind of podcast I do, so I want to vet your podcast and make sure it's a good one before I join. And we were pleased that we passed his test. So super cool to talk to Martin Fowler, one of our favorite interviews we've done. So check that out if you haven't checked it out yet. It's live on all of our channels. And in the meantime, we've got the Unicorn Project here for you. Like we said, this is part 2 of 3 of our coverage of the Unicorn Project. If you haven't seen part 1, you can go and check it out right now. But we do these podcasts in a way where you don't have to listen to part 1 to enjoy our part 2 discussion. So stick around for this one too if you don't want to switch between episodes. Well, just give a quick summary of the book again. The author introduction, this is written by Gene Kim. Gene Kim is a multiple award-winning CTO, researcher, and author, and has been studying high-performing technology organizations since 1999. He was founder and CTO of Tripwire for 13 years. He's written 6 books, including The Unicorn Project, The Phoenix Project, The DevOps Handbook, the Shingo Publication Award-winning Accelerate, and the Visible Ops Handbook series. Since 2014, he has been the founder and organizer of the DevOps Enterprise Summit, studying the technology transformations of large, complex organizations. The book introduction we get from Amazon.com is this highly anticipated follow-up to the best-selling title, The Phoenix Project, takes another look at Parts Unlimited, this time from the perspective of software development. In the Unicorn Project, we follow Maxine, a senior lead developer and architect, as she is exiled to the Phoenix Project to the horror of her friends and colleagues as punishment for contributing to a payroll outage. She tries to survive in what feels like a heartless and uncaring bureaucracy and to work within a system where no one can get anything done without endless committees, paperwork, and approvals. So like we talked about last week, this is, I guess a follow-up is probably the best way, like they say, to the Phoenix Project. Not a sequel. It's an alternative look at the same timeline as the Phoenix Project. And we discussed a little bit last week about what the Phoenix Project is and what makes this book different. The Unicorn Project and the Phoenix Project makes them different from the books we usually cover, where it's a novel, a parable, I think is how the author puts it. So a little different. So we are following Maxine on her journey in the Phoenix Project. Nathan, what are your thoughts on part 2 this week after we left off on part 1? Part 1 was a lot about kind of like the bureaucracy and like how maddening it is to work in these stifling environments. Where are we at on part 2?
Yeah. So, if we're following this narrative, this sort of the hero's journey, which is a, pretty classic character development and storyline. In this case, we're actually seeing the implementation of the 5 ideals. And just a quick refresher, the 5 ideals are, the first one is locality and simplicity. The second one is focus, flow, and joy. And we'll touch on these while we're having our conversation because these come up a lot. Number 3 is improvement of daily work. Number 4 is psychological safety. And number 5 is customer focus. And I think while we identified these in the first section, we're actually starting to tease these out and test them and see either opportunities to implement some of the ideals or challenges that they keep running into because the ideals are being violated. And yeah, this section's been really cool. It's again, it's this. I've definitely been in situations like this, and I'm not as cool as Maxine. So Maxine and her scrappy group of misfits are able to pull off some amazing hijinks, and it's pretty cool and inspiring to see what they're doing.
Yeah, this week we're definitely getting into the meat of actually transforming the business. They're getting some wins on the board here, which is great to see. Um, following Maxine, especially in the first part of the book, it's too real, right? If you've worked at one of these places, and
Yep. I also
and
appreciated that something blew up in their face, right? In section
it's true.
two, they're kind of going. They're just executing, and then a big surprise happens, and again, it's to show how this new adaptability actually helps them, resolve this quicker and learn from it, and it's again really cool little parable, I guess.
Yeah, no one likes those characters in books or movies that are just always right, and
Right,
you know
overpowered.
exactly. And the whole book is about how clearly this person is so smart, and if only everyone would listen to them, right? I mean, uh, these this team on the Phoenix Project, or I guess the Unicorn Project, they are smart and they're trying to apply a lot of modern development practices, but it doesn't always go exactly the way they want it to. But still, good to see them get some wins. And I will also just give a plug for the book. I wrote in my notes, I said, "Go home, everyone," just because I keep seeing in the books, like they're like, "What time did we deploy the application last night?" Like 7 p.m. I'm like, 7 p.m. Go
Right.
home. Like,
Yeah, no, there was the other one. They were like, "Oh yeah, got this thing done over the weekend," and I'm like,
I
"Gosh,
know.
come on, guys."
Like, can we move some
Yeah.
furniture on the weekend? I'm like, what are you talking about?
Right.
Um, and listen, I am a reluctant defender of crunch time. I think there are just some times where there are really important business priorities that have to get done, and you have to uh, work hard, and that'll include some evenings, maybe a weekend. But like we read in Slow Productivity by Cal Newport, there should be seasonality in how we work. And sometimes I read this book and I'm like, I'm not seeing the seasonality here. It doesn't seem like there was anything particular about this week that really required you to be putting in this many hours. And there's also a part of me that's like, guys, you probably will make a lot more money somewhere else. So,
Right. No,
yeah.
it's funny that I had some similar feelings because I've been on teams that we've been able to step up and do some pretty Herculean efforts, and it's really difficult to get the visibility that you need to have that honored because depending on who leadership is, they may just come to expect it, right? They may just say, "Oh, you know what? This is just how they work. They love their night owls. They love working on this stuff." And maybe if you're early in your career, you can kind of get away with that a little bit more, just because you're hungry, you want to like do a bunch of stuff. You know, you're willing to do this, but when you're starting to balance your life with children and a spouse and all these other things, it's very easy to overstep that boundary. And again, the book doesn't really address that so far, right?
Yeah, right. Which, like, and I can appreciate, like, not everything can be for everyone and address every single thing, right? Like, one of my favorite like tweets is someone, because like anytime anyone posts something on Twitter, right, someone will be like, "Well, this doesn't apply to me," and someone's like, "Hi, most annoying person you've ever met here. Like, I've noticed that
Right,
this 280 character tweet doesn't address every single facet of my living condition, me, the main character of the
right,
universe, right?" And
right.
so, like, there is a part. I mean, and I think we mentioned it last week, kind of about like Clean Coder, where like I like a lot of the advice in Clean Coder, and I also think that like you have to understand how it applies to you and your specific living conditions. Because I like this is a novel. It's a novel about software development. And it's a little like asking like in that TV show 24, right? With like where every episode was set to like an actual hour, kind of being like, when does Jack Bauer use the bathroom? It's like, do you want to see Jack Bauer use the bathroom? Um, and there's a little here where I'm like, Maxine, what about your husband and two children? Just because that's something that's been really important to me with my four kids, and my
Right.
wife is like being done at 5 o'clock, unless it's like an emergency. So again,
And and maybe
ugh.
it'll happen in part 3, but it's I think it would also be useful to show a cautionary tale of maybe someone who drops into hero mode too much,
Yeah.
right? So it
Yeah.
would be really interesting to be like, look, I hear you, I see where your heart is, but this actually violates, you know, this actually violates some of the focus, flow, and joy principles,
Yeah.
right? Or something like that.
Absolutely.
I like your idea of seasonality. I think, that was brought up in slow productivity as well. And yeah, so anyway, it's going to be cool to dive into this, because this is there's a lot of juicy topics in this one.
Absolutely. So we're going to keep discussing Maxine's journey on the Phoenix Project in the book Unicorn Project right after a quick break. And we are back. So let's kind of pick up where we left off. So Maxine, she has been assigned to this new team. It's called Data Hub. And so what's cool about this is kind of some of her friends from the rebellion kind of organize the leader of the rebellion, Kurt. He gets this dev manager position on Data Hub. So now Maxine is on like an actual team. It's not the coolest team in the world. They mentioned they're using kind of like a lot of old technologies, and they're kind of like this connection point for like a lot of different applications in the company. But she has a team now, and she's working with them. Um, and so one thing I liked in this is she kind of shows off her skills right at the beginning, where one of the developers is working like a race condition bug, and that's a really hard thing to test. But Maxine employs some functional programming with immutability of state, and writes some unit tests that kind of get it working. Everything's good to go, right? And then what happens? She says, "Okay, we fixed the bug. When does it go to production?" And he says, "Well, not for at least 2 weeks." And she's like, "What's in 2 weeks?" She's like, "That's testing day. That's when QA tests all of our code. And if there are any bugs, they'll send us a spreadsheet a week later with and let us know, what needs to be fixed." And so you're finding out that like there's at least a 3-week delay time from writing the code to actually getting it in production, which seems crazy to me. Nathan, what are your thoughts on kind of as we're getting
Oh man,
started with this journey?
we had something similar to this on that a project that I was working on in my last company, and it was a 3-month lead time
Oh my
between when
heavens!
we fixed something. And again, it was one of those where we found an issue, we introduced a new pattern, we actually had full test coverage, we were really excited, and then we realized there was like 5 repositories that it had to get pushed through. Like there's like references to the different libraries, and it was just like the craziest structure. And again, you look at this and you have a lot of empathy of like, hey, I understand why some decisions were made this way, in the past, but this isn't serving us well. And it was this exact thing where like we did this, but then we had to like engage with the QA team, and the QA team has their own processes. They use their own ticketing system. They had their own way of defining whether something was like functional or not. It was really interesting. They didn't have any way of like knowing whether it was a user facing feature or some sort of like backend resilience feature. And so when we were showing them, and in this case, we were actually introducing like this thing called a circuit breaker. When we introduced this pattern, it was like, it was really interesting to have to like, we had to have a basic conversation on how distributed systems work. And they're really tooled up for like, oh, is the date picker functioning the
Yeah,
way I want it
yeah,
to, right? And so it was a very challenging but fascinating glimpse into how we work across teams. And I had a lot of empathy for this section, because I was like, oh boy, I've been here not too long ago.
yeah. I definitely been there. I remember when I worked at one of the companies I worked at was kind of divided across multiple divisions, and the division that I was assigned to was fine, but then I got assigned kind of as like a resource to another project in one of the other company's divisions, and yeah, that it was kind of like a classic waterfall project. Like all the requirements have been defined up front, and y- yeah, you ship them all the features off to QA, and like it's just like yeah, I think Maxine says, this is the opposite of the second ideal. She thinks we're just a stupid feature factory pushing out widgets that customers may or may not care about. Work is not fun and full of joy like I know it should be. There's no flow of features. There's no feedback, and there certainly isn't any learning, she thinks. I think about the developer in the first part when the launch completely breaks, but he doesn't care because that's not his job. He's just shipping features.
Right.
Um, and yeah, you really see kind of here that idea of locality, right? And that's actually something Maxine strives to fix because they're so separate from QA in the narrative, the story. They're actually even in separate buildings. So Maxine actually in the next chapter takes it on herself to when testing day comes around, she is all excited about testing day. So she actually goes and throws like a little party for QA, like buys a bunch of donuts, brings it over, and yeah, and it's just trying to like get in the good graces of QA. I would just like to point out for anyone who is listening that this is excellent, right? I have done this in my career. I've been remote for a while now, and it's actually one I like remote work and bought on it for a lot of reasons. I do miss how easy it was to make friends by giving people treats because I would do that when I was in the office. Like, yeah, just show up with donuts, right? And like you make people like you really easily. Um, and uh, so she's just trying to like partner up with QA, right? Hoping that maybe they can start testing their features quicker. Um, Nathan, what did you think about this? And maybe also about striking up alliances with other teams. You ever had to do that in your career?
Yeah. This one's interesting too, and I think that they nail the dynamic that QA can fall into, especially in like legacy companies where they're almost like second tier, or second class citizens. A lot of folks that are in QA at these more traditional companies, maybe automation isn't even in their vocabulary, right? It's a bunch of checklists and very detail oriented folks who go through and make sure that requirements are met. Um, and what ends up happening is that a couple of things. One is that QA is kind of beat around in that they are the scapegoat for missing stuff, right? Like so these developers will write all this code. QA is supposed to make sure that it doesn't break stuff, and if they miss things, they kind of get the blame. And of course, that makes them more defensive. That makes them put up more bureaucratic red tape. It puts more really formal processes, and this is one of the things that they talk about, right? Is that there's these teams start acting very defensively. It actually reminds me a lot of Recoding America, right? You can see
Oh yeah,
why
yeah,
these legacy systems built up these huge bureaucracies, and they kind of throw their hands up, and they're in these sort of permanent establishments. Um, and yeah, I thought it was so cool for her to this strategy of Maxine trying to break the ice. Of course, she runs into some really interesting stuff, right? She gets these um, sort of boutique donut shop donuts, and she's really happy about it. And then realizes that there is no testing day, right? She's like excited about it. They basically have to go to a bunch of different places, and the bunch of the middle management they run into is very suspicious of the
yeah, yeah.
motivations of the dev team. And I've run into this before too, because they're like, who are you? What are you doing here? And then trying to break that ice of like getting, peeling back those layers, the defense mechanisms that are in place, and giving people permission to take risks. I think that's like a big part of this as well. And a lot of times, and I think Maxine does this, the dev team does a really good job of willing to shoulder what's perceived as risk on themselves. And I've done this at other places where you can see that there's not the psychological safety. People don't feel like if they go out, they're going to get in a lot of trouble, basically. So you say, look, try it my way. And if it doesn't work out, like just blame it on me. Like I'm the new guy. Like it just, it's my fault for doing this. Typically it's a pretty it's not really high risk. It's like perceived as high risk. And if you're willing to take that on, it goes a long way. It's this reciprocation that happens. They're saying like, look, just blame it on me. And we actually talked about this a lot at my startup, which was getting like the you get like newbie points. So if you're new,
Yeah.
it gives you this excuse to like kind of break processes a little bit. And you're like, oh well, yeah, I'm new. I just didn't realize I couldn't do that, right? Like which is awesome. I will say take advantage of it, because once you're on a team for 6 months, you can't be like I'm the new person, and
Yeah,
But if you're new to a team, if you just got moved over to Data Hub, and then you're like, act like there's an old show called Columbo. I don't know if you've ever seen this show.
I don't think I've
Um,
seen it, but I do know
oh my gosh.
Columbo.
So it's an old detective show. My mom loved the show and I would watch it. But Columbo kind of looked like this like dunce of a detective. And he was always solving these really like there's these super intelligent folks who are trying to get away with crazy stuff. But he'd come in and ask what sounded like really dumb questions. But really what he was doing was entrapping these super smart criminals into self-contradictions. I don't mean that you're trying to trap criminals, but I do think that you can come in and look like the dumbest person in the room sometimes because what you're really trying to do is get down to the essence of the problem that you're trying to solve. And then by doing this, you actually end up being the smartest person in the room, right? Like it gets down to this like understanding the fundamentals of how a business functions, or asking a smart group of people who seem to be, shooting themselves in the foot. Why are we doing it this way? What is this still serving us well? And it gives you this opportunity to kind of get down to these, to get, are we in alignment with these ideals? And I think that this is what Maxine and her team did expertly with the QA stuff, is they ruffled enough feathers to actually get senior leadership buy-in on some pretty important things that they had to get done, even though they kept hitting all kinds of roadblocks.
Yeah,
I'm going to flip this back to you, Carter. Have you and your team ever been able to break through maybe some organizational roadblocks with an initiative that you've been trying to push through?
I'm trying to think about that. I mean, I think what's interesting about this book, and because this is very much kind of like taking the position of like a legacy, like this is a legacy business, right? This is a business that's trying to transition into being more of like a tech business, or at least having tech be more like of a core competency, right? And I think what's interesting reading about kind of all these practices and how they spring up, like having separate QA, project management being really detached, same with product management, having a bunch of layers of middle management. In a lot of ways, I think this is like the natural order. It's like, have you ever heard of that phenomenon? I think it's called carcinization, but it's like nature loves to make crabs. Like if you look at like the ocean, yeah, like there's like a bunch of different kinds of crabs, but they don't share a common genetic origin. There's just a bunch of different species who have all evolved to be crabs, right? I don't know why exactly, but it's an ideal form factor for living in the ocean, I guess. And like that's kind of what Parts Unlimited, the business in the Unicorn Project is like. It is like the crab of businesses. I think a lot of these practices spring up very naturally, and you actually read about it later in the books that like a lot of developers contribute to putting in these practices because like you got to be safe, because it's like what was this is in fundamentals of software architecture, right? Like the Italy problem they talk about, right? Like what if we lose Italy because that business lost Italy one time, and so you kind of overreact to these moments and you put in all of this bureaucracy, and then you just wind up like really ossifying the organization. And then a lot of the kind of like modern DevOps practices that this book preaches, they're not obvious, right? And in a lot of ways, that's like, yeah, it's very against the natural order. And it's easy to think that they're obvious because if you work at kind of a lot of places where like tech is the core competency, that is just how things are done.
Right.
But it's done deliberately that way to break up what would naturally occur, which is the structure you get in the Unicorn Project. All of that to say, I've been fortunate to work at places where tech is the core competency, and usually more mature businesses. So I haven't had to do something kind of like this where we really want to change up like a key practice to how the business is working and how the development flow goes, because like the places I've worked at, fortunately, we've just all been on board with kind of like modern development practices. The one place that wasn't was that awful little startup, which I almost wore a shirt today that had their logo, and then I made sure to change because I will not reveal who they are.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Yeah, and that one was just really bad, and I quit. But I also have been like in opposite situations. Like I have this team I'm working on at work where I had some very different ideas about kind of what the ownership model should look like for our team, and I kind of took it to our team and said like, I think we're on the wrong path, and it was actually them who convinced me otherwise. And, I sat down with my director and with the other engineers, and um, they, said like, I think the way we want to do it this way actually makes a lot more sense. And so, um, all that to say, like, I haven't had to go real rogue like the people in the Unicorn Project have, and really, change some key ways to how we're doing development. But like, I sympathize because, man, it's again, the very small amount of time I worked at a place like this, like, it's not fun. It's not fun at all.
I did think that it was and they kind of bring this up in various parts though. The organization agreed to this like 30-day feature freeze. And I was waiting for this to happen, and it did to some degree, though I'll tell you that my personal experience was far worse in that people agreed to a feature freeze, and I actually advocated for something. I mean, it's almost identical to this, where I was like, hey, we've got so there's this concept of an error budget. They don't bring it up in this book, but I'll bring it up here. The idea of an error budget is from SRE, I think from the Google SRE book. And the idea is that if you exceed your error budget, if you have too many errors happening, then you freeze features. Features get traded off for error correction development. So working on stability. So there's this like give and take. So much budget goes to stability work, so much budget goes to feature work. And if you exceed your error budget, then the feature work goes down. In this case, they decided that aggressively they want to pay some tech debt on stability. And I've seen this happen. People agree. They're like, yeah. What if we froze feature development for 30 days? Like, I think I can pull this off. And then what ends up happening is project managers and product managers come in and they think the rule doesn't apply to them.
Yeah.
So like increasingly they come in and they're like, yeah. Well, I love this idea. I think it's great, but like we have to get this feature done, right? Like they come in and so they start nickel and diming, and all of a sudden all these engineers and this like really cool cheerleading that goes on about like, oh no, we're going to take this super serious. It gets whittled away down to the fact that you're like, didn't we say that we were going to do feature development? I mean, stop feature development. Didn't we say that we were going to do stability? Why isn't it more stable now? And we already see this happening here, but they still somehow get away with the fact that they like, we just have to assume that somehow they mostly got feature freezes in place. And it does help solve some problems, but I had something very similar. And again, this is where like organizational problems hit, is that if you're in a Phoenix project like organization, making these changes and getting leadership to actually follow through is incredibly difficult, right?
Yeah.
You might get lucky that you can like fly under the radar and do some crazy stuff despite the organization. But unless you get executive leadership and sponsors, which they do quite well in this book, unless you actually pull that off, you will not fit. Like, it doesn't matter if there's a rebellion. If you don't get folks to convert to your side from leadership, it will not work. I will like hands down say that it and not only that, like you might actually be looked at as really bad in the organization, right? Especially like I think in chapter 10, Maxine says, why aren't developers able to push their own changes to production, right? Like she's very confused as to like why we can't take ownership and push things through. And because they have this like one blessed person.
I wanted to talk about that. I felt physical pain hearing about this guy.
Yeah. So here's the crazy part. I literally experienced this. We actually had our top engineers who were doing for this one sub project that we had. They had this like team of top engineers who were literally all they did was merge conflict resolution.
Yeah.
So that they could do this like deployment. And I mean, it was absolute insanity. So,
because they have basically like, you talk about how something blows up in the Data Hub team's face a little later on, but kind of before that, we get an example of something going wrong under the current order, right?
Ooh,
which is like, they have merge day is what they call it, right? Because all the developers' changes for the past like month or whatever all get merged in on the same day, and they have like this big spreadsheet of like 350 merges they have to do at a time, right? And it's obviously this big pain. And I know that like, and it's funny hearing at one point in the book, they're like, yeah, merge day is such a big pain. We're thinking about moving it to like once a quarter, maybe once every 6 months. And you're like,
you're making like, things worse.
Exactly. How you make merge day less painful is you should be merging like every day. Anyhow, so during merge day, some merge goes wrong, and something goes down, and I think they can't get prices or something like that. And so you've got, but because it's merge day, you've got all the managers in the same room, and like despite all the managers being in the same room, like it takes them some time until one person says like, okay, I'm pretty sure it's my team. They identify the commit. I say, okay, we need to roll this back. And Maxine's like, all right, let's do it. I go, oh, no, we can't do that. We need the source code manager, right? Because the source code manager is, like you said, Nathan, the one blessed person who can, who has permission to roll it back. And then like, so they have to track him down and like, oh, he's at lunch. Okay, well, we'll get him later. And then they finally get him down. The whole time the website is down and customers can't process orders. They finally get him. What does he do? He copies and pastes code, into a proper commit and then ships it off. Like insane. But you were saying you've seen this, Nathan?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's absolutely insane. And it's the way that I've seen things. And again, they do the same thing. So she's asking like, why? Why is this person the one? And then finally, like, and they look at her like she's crazy. And finally someone goes, compliance. And another person chimes in, information security. And then all around the room, you hear like ITIL, change management, SOX, PCI, regulators. And these are all the very valid reasons that these defense mechanisms have been put in place. Like, depending on how you interpret the rules, you have to have these separations of concerns. You can't have somebody who like there's a rule in SOX and PCI stuff. It's like, if you write the code, you actually can't deploy to production. That is actually a rule. The thing is that if you actually have systems that do this, so like I can't physically log into the machine, but my CI/CD process can, and it's okay actually for me to actually press the button. But the way that certain people interpret this, it doesn't jive because they aren't from that world. It used to be that you had to SSH or remote desktop into a machine and pull code down, and the whole idea was that they didn't want you to secretly put some conflict of interest. You wrote some code that did the Office Space thing where you like scraped some decimal points off of some stuff and put it in your Swiss bank account. And so these things are in place, but what ends up happening is that you end up becoming a prisoner. And I think the quote was, "We don't even need guards anymore. We love being prisoners so much that we just think the bars are there to keep us safe." And this is, I mean, again, so true. It's like there's these true isms that'll happen in an organization, and it's like, no, we don't question it because it's been this way. It's always been this way. And this actually comes up, I think, in the chapter or two previous, is that don't rock the boat, don't make any changes. You don't understand, like you just have no way of understanding why it's like this. And if you question it, you're going to waste a bunch of people's time, right? There's like this, again, it gets back into the psychological safety thing. And luckily this team keeps pushing back and says like, and so one of the cool things that happens is they don't call it entirely the inverse Conway maneuver, but it is the inverse Conway maneuver. They somehow decide that Data Hub should get decoupled from the deployment for the rest of the Phoenix project. And I think this is a huge, turning point in the book.
Absolutely. And I want to talk more about that and we'll take a quick break before we do. But before we get to that break, I just wanted to point out that that this comment about, we love being prisoners so much, we just think the bars are there to keep us safe. I think part of why that happens is, and we talked about this last week, right? Like a huge amount of like psychological drain that happens from your job is like worrying about things outside of your control. Right. And, like if you show up every day so frustrated about the way that all the processes are, like that's really, really annoying, especially in a place where you can't get institutional buy-in and you can't get change. I think it's a defense mechanism, and I think it's an appropriate defense mechanism, just to be like, okay, I am a prisoner. I'll just stay here. I'll show up. I'll do my job. I'll get my paycheck. I'll go home. Right. And so, this is, we talked about it last week too. Like there's a lot of reasons why you might not be able to quit your job and why you might need to try to stick it out and make something work here. More power to you. I think you've got to figure out still how you let go at 5 o'clock and how you say, I'm not going to worry and think about this until tomorrow, because like it'll just eat you alive. I've been in situations like that before, and it's really, really frustrating. But like you mentioned, Data Hub starts to gain some independence through you're right. It is the inverse Conway maneuver. We're going to talk about that in the next part of their journey and more after a quick break. And we are back. So in chapter 11, they do get Data Hub to break off. And like Nathan mentioned, it's the inverse Conway maneuver. And they start doing things like they move some dev over to sit with QA, and they move some QA to sit over with dev. Really, the key to them getting permission to kind of break off, because basically what they want to do is they want to run more like a modern team, right? They want to they want to build their own containers, their own dev environment. They want to ship it and run it. It's the classic you build it, you run it culture, to the point that an engineer was like, wait a minute, are we gonna have to start carrying pagers now? And she was like, yeah.
Yep.
And I will say that I find like some people really, really don't want to be on call. And like, I get it, on call stinks. And it also stinks if you feel like your on call load is super heavy and you don't have the tools or ability or permission to reduce it. I will say that there is a lot of freedom in owning what you run and just feeling like that. I think it's like a high agency culture, and you feel a good degree of control over what you're putting out. But one of the reasons they're able to get the permission to kind of break this off and run it more like a modern team is because they get business buy-in. They're basically these promotions that Parts Unlimited, these seasonal promotions that Parts Unlimited wants to run, but there's a huge lead time to like getting products into the system, getting SKUs assigned, and then bundling up the promotions that like they've missed like the last 2 seasonal promotions because they just can't do it. So it's actually Maxine who figures this out and figures out that Data Hub could play a key part in getting these promotions to be more self-serve for the business. And they go all the way up to like one of the executives who, is in charge of, she has like P&L responsibility, profit and loss responsibility for this section. And she's like, totally, I'll throw my weight behind this. And I thought this was key, because I think this is something that developers miss a lot, right? Is they forget that, like, of course our code, like, it'd just be better to have like a standard 2-pizza team and to be doing independent deploys, have automated CI/CD servers, things like that. But you have to explain to the business how it'll actually deliver value for the customer. And this is great too, because we talked about last week about like the idea of core versus context, right? Like, are you something that's making money or just something that's kind of supporting? I would define Data Hub as definitely more context than core, but context still delivers business value. And they were able to find out where they could deliver business value. And by embracing that and making the argument for their case, they're able to start getting decoupled, which I thought was super neat.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the part where I've struggled in my career, is getting back to that. So one of the 5 ideals is customer focus, right? And so what Maxine did expertly here and her team was seeing where if they had just said, we can make Data Hub way better, and it would be really cool if we're not part of them, and we're just going to like do this and take our toys and go home and kind of like build our own thing. No one cares, right? Literally no one cares. And you probably don't have the credibility. They probably don't trust you. Look at what ops has done in the past. Look at what the engineering teams have done in the past. And you want to go off and do a bunch of stuff that nobody's agreed to. And we're going to touch on this. There's this architectural review board that is a big part of this. And they're super scared about any changes whatsoever. And so the fact that she finds this business value in this team or to solve a real problem that they keep running into, and then they were able to sell it to that other division of the company to say, hey, look, if you get behind us, if you let us do this, you're going to be able to start doing dynamic SKU updates outside of release cycles and do all these other really cool things that they've been like, we've been trying to figure out how to do this for years, right? And that was, again, expert move. It's something that I aspire to doing a better job. Sometimes I'm in alignment with this, but sometimes I miss the mark, right? I like to talk about it being like the wanderlust. Like we can get really into our tooling and we think very abstractly. When you become an expert in something, you think very abstractly. So you might say like, immutable infrastructure. Well, the person in charge of P&L does not care. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Like they don't care. Immutable, whatever in there. They're like, whatever gets me, my bonus at the end of the quarter or whatever. And so you being able to like show them like, no, if we build these foundations, you will be able to do this and you don't even have to talk to us anymore, at least not on a regular basis, unless you need, feature updates or something. So it's such a smart way of getting buy-in. And I think it's exactly what they need to address sort of like the mini boss that they're about to fight, which is this review board. And they what's the term? LARB, I think is what
The something architectural review board.
Yeah.
I felt shame reading this book or reading this part because this is the architectural review board, right? Where you have to go and you have to argue and say like, hey, we want to start doing this with our architecture. They meet like every like month or so. Like it's a huge bottleneck. I worked on this. I worked in a department that was like this. This was my first job out of college. Most of the places I've worked for have been like kind of pure tech companies. The first place I worked for was not that. Not dinosaur kind of like Parts Unlimited here, but definitely not a tech company. And I worked for this department called Reference Architecture, which I loved the engineers there. Some of the smartest guys I've worked with. My director in particular is still, in my opinion, about the gold standard for a director. But just, and you kind of see it again. It's with companies that don't really understand. They're not tech companies, right? And so what was kind of Reference Architecture's business? Well, it was to standardize all the technology everyone was working on. So it's like, you want to use React for your project? You can't do that because we use Angular, right? You want to use this framework? Can't do that because we do that, right? And same with like any open source software had to go through us for approval, right? And like, it was so dumb. Like they had me, who was like an intern, doing like open source software review, right? Like insane. Like I looking back on it now, the moment I started getting assigned those tickets is the moment I would have blown the whole process up and been like, what does Carter know that the people who are like actually trying to use this software do? The role of the department. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying, this is what we've talked about with Neal Ford and stuff. This is very common within these larger enterprise institutions where they try to standardize things, but what you end up doing is coupling, right?
Absolutely. Well, and it's tied to like old ways of thinking, right? Because in the past it made sense to standardize because software was expensive. But with everything being open source now, like this idea that like, oh, it'll be so much more efficient if we standardize because then everyone will be using the same thing. But you're removing locality. You're now everything has to go through this one department. The department did a lot of really useful things. Like for example, like application scaffolding, right? Like at this business, like if you wanted to spin up an internal website, right? There was a lot of kind of like middleware authentication blocks, things like that were tricky, and so we would provide like scaffolding. So like, it's really easy to do that. We had a whole library of UI components because this business required you to adhere pretty strictly to a style guide, and so like that stuff was really helpful too. And about halfway through my tenure there, it did wind up getting switched to where reference architecture moved into an advisory role rather than like a mandatory role, because like people just hated our guts, which like was a surprise to me. So yeah, like reading about this TEP-LARB board, right? Like I'm like, like we weren't this bad, but like we were fulfilling this role. And like it's bad in this book. Like someone wants to use Apache Tomcat,
right?
And it has like this pitch, and they're like, I don't know if we can support it, and we haven't, they're like, and someone's like, this is a Tomcat. Like everyone uses Tomcat. Like Netflix uses Tomcat. Right. They're like, why don't you give us a write-up of all the security vulnerabilities it's faced in the past 6 months and how quickly they were patched, right? And it's just like, like I don't know. It's frustrating to read.
Yeah, it was really interesting, and I loved that they were like the second. So they were the second team to do their presentation to the LARB, and the first one was this Tomcat one, which is, and again, it was hilarious because I remember in my startup we inherited some Java code base that we were pulling it with a contractor, and we were using Tomcat, and I still remember that we worked with this really great guy. He's from Serbia. And the way that he would say Tomcat was just like, it's like permanently imprinted in my brain. I'm gonna spare you my bad Serbian accent, but it was, I thought of that as old technology, and that was in 2016, 2015, something like that. And so this idea that the LARB is doing basically stability theater, right? They're acting as if they're,
That's a great way. I've never heard of that. Stability theater.
yeah. So, I mean,
Yeah.
they're like putting up barriers to put up barriers because they feel like, oh, well, I have to put up barriers. It's my job. That's why they hired us to, or that's why we're this board. And it's interesting. It wasn't this bad, but at my last company, there was a subset, and I would say this is in the highly functional part of the company, the one that actually built really nice architectures. The thing was that we had a LARB, and the funny thing was, if you had to get in front of them, you knew it was going to take 6 months for this to get approved, right? Because you were probably pushing some new idea, right? Like maybe this was some new Kafka event stream processing pattern that you're trying to do so that we can like decouple asynchronous stuff better. You're doing something that's like, it is a pretty big decision that you might need to do things. But unfortunately, they always wanted it to be like, oh, well, if it's going to solve a problem for you, we wanted you to generalize it so it solves a problem for everyone in the organization so that everyone can use this cool new pattern. And thank you for bringing this to us, right? It was positive, but it was also like, no, I shouldn't generalize this. I need to solve the problem for my team, right? And then we should think of it from a product standpoint of, hey, if this is a great pattern, we'd love to help work with other teams to extend it, or we'd love the architects to look at it and figure out how they can generalize it. But allowing the teams to work independently. And so we end up having groups that were like, how could you make enough changes with existing tools that didn't hit a LARB review session? You're like, oh, can I grab off the shelf stuff and then introduce enough pattern changes that didn't trigger the LARB? Because if you did, oh man, 6 months, you're not going to be able to do anything, fun for 6 months. So we hear the Tomcat thing, and then they come in, and it's like they're aliens from outer space, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
They're like, hey, we want to build our own microservice, basically. We're going to do this independently. And they it's like, it was the funniest. I thought this is like one of my favorite sections of the whole book, because they just were like, yeah, well, if you do this, then you're gonna have to take ownership of this, and you're gonna have to you're gonna take over having to do this, and you have to have these sponsors. And they kept coming back with like, oh, we do, and we have this, and I'm happy to take this on. And they just they're like, okay, how about, it's a lot of stuff going on here. Why don't we bring this back in 6 months, and then we'll have a conversation about it. Yeah.
It reminds me of like that. I don't know if you've ever seen that meme, but it's like the Chad, like Wojak or whatever, the guy with like the big old
Chad.
chin. Yeah, exactly. And then the blonde beard and all that. And because you'll see it like in arguments on Twitter sometimes, someone will be like, oh yeah, well, if you believe that, then you'll have to do this. But like this is like something that's totally okay. And just like the Chad just like gets closer and closer to the person, whispers like, your terms are acceptable. And like that's how I felt like with the architectural review board. It's like, oh well, okay, if you want to do this, well, you're gonna have to own it. It's like, fine.
Oh, they were acting so dismissive, and just like everything they're giving feedback on is very reasonable, and yet the way that they were phrasing it, it was like, oh yeah, like, can you imagine? Could you imagine taking this over yourself? And so the cool thing is they do this somehow. They push these ideas through. They've really again the whole time, right? We've been
so they do get shut down by the board, right?
Yes.
But it's because they have the strong business sponsors,
right? That
they do get permission to kind of to move around. And so yeah. So you were saying, so they do get permission to push this through, and then I mean after they get permission to push it through, and then this is where things kind of blow up in their face, isn't that right?
So this is one of those like told you so moments. I think there's probably somebody from the LARB who's like, this is why we don't allow this. But they've got everything's looking like super amazing. They've got these new environments. They've got immutable infrastructure. They're able to like push all this stuff through. One of the things that I thought was interesting, and I had never heard of this. I mean, it made sense immediately before they even explained it. There's this thing called white space deployment. I loved this because it was a way for them. They would literally just like add white space to like a YAML file, and then force a redeploy, right? So they would invalidate the hashes of like the get, their git commit would get a unique git commit, and it would force a new deployment. And the idea was keep doing this until change management is stable, even though we know nothing should change. And so if you introduce something that should have no side effects and you find side effects, you know that you need to fix stuff until your infrastructure is immutable. I thought that was smart. I will totally steal this one day. But I thought that was kind of interesting.
I've never done that like cleverly, but I have done that. And like, what? Why didn't it deploy? I'll just add some white space and make it deploy again.
Right.
But
Or like put some fluff in a description or something,
Exactly.
something that I know isn't going to actually like affect the deployment. So anyway, they get this to a stable point, and then despite all of this, a deploy goes sideways and production goes down. Right. And this triggers this, and again, a fantastic, use of story and stuff to introduce ideas, but they actually go through, and we as the reader get to experience a blameless postmortem.
The blameless postmortem.
Yes.
Probably our favorite concept on this podcast.
Exactly.
No, it's great, right? This is the fifth ideal, right? This is psychological safety. And it's totally, like it's great to see it play out, right? In this case, they have the whole team together. They're kind of piecing this together, right? It's actually interesting to see a postmortem take place in this way, because the postmortems I've done in the past have been a little more like, it's not that everyone gets together to like figure out exactly what went wrong. Mm-hmm. Usually one person is assigned the task of assembling the timeline and like assembling everything that kind of went wrong, and then they present it to the team. From just like a resource usage standpoint, I kind of like that perspective better. I'm also a big fan of like a good strong writing culture, and so I think kind of like writing all this stuff down and having it assemble, in a report, so to speak, and then presenting it to everyone can be good. But either way, right? Like it's really great to see in this book, because one of the developer who causes the problem, he misses like a database connection string or whatever, right?
Yep. He
is just so upset with himself. He's like, I never make mistakes like this. I can't believe it. He's like, I hadn't used this tool before, and I wasn't used to even reading like the log messages like on this tool, and they were just flowing by so fast. And the manager, Kurt, is just great. He's like, we're not blaming anyone. He's like, we're just here to learn. He's like, we believe that everyone is doing the best with the knowledge they have. And it's just, it's a perfect example of the blameless postmortem, right? But you can't do it without that culture of psychological safety.
Exactly. And the thing is, the team allowed one individual to put to fat finger a URL string, right? And so one of the cool things about this postmortem is like, if you dove into the 5 whys and you dove into these like other pieces of the postmortem process, you could build a piece of tooling that does a sanity check on the URL before it does it, or remove the fact that somebody's manually changing URL strings at all and have this entirely configuration management driven. Maybe they were changing so much stuff and that just was like in a to-do list. And now this is a catalyst for saying, hey, we shouldn't be touching URL strings. This is the kind of stuff that happens if we do that. And I loved this. I loved, and so here's the thing. I've been in a couple of organizations where we had good postmortem cultures, and I've been in most of them which we've had really bad postmortem cultures. I've seen it successfully with the owner of the incident doing the timeline and pulling things together before everybody's there. I love that method too. I'm a big fan. It's typically the person who was on call who responded. That's how we did it. At least.
Yeah, that's about what we did too.
And one of the cool things was, and this is a side note, it drives me crazy. So I love asynchronous communication tools like Slack. It can be overwhelming if the organization's too crazy. But one of the things that I was a big pet peeve of mine is that a lot of organizations, at least the one I was in recently, obsessed with private channels in direct messages versus public chat channels. And one of the biggest indicators to me of a psychological safety culture is the willingness to have focused public channels in your organization.
Yeah.
And I'll say one of the reasons that's huge for postmortems is that, and I learned this at one of the teams that I loved working on. It was a company that got acquired by Figma, but they had a really great engineering culture. You can do an archive link of individual chat messages from Slack into our postmortem documents. So when we built the timeline, we would actually link back to, this is when this thing blew up. And this is when this thing blew up, and then all of a sudden, like, here's all the stuff that I had to do to to address what was going on, and you could link back and see the conversation of like, oh yeah, this is what happened. This is when things went sideways, or this is what so and so said. And it was nice for you to kind of like build this up, and then you get the whole group together, and then they would confirm that the timeline, right? Are you missing something? Is this happened before in like a different variation? And again, I loved it because the cultures that have good postmortem processes, there is no finger pointing, right? It really is this like, this really went sideways, and we were not prepared for what happened here. And did we communicate to the customer well? Was this customer facing? Like we kind of go through all these pieces. And anyway, I loved it. I mean, obviously, this is meant to show how a postmortem could go. I do think if you don't have a postmortem culture, ask somebody to put together a timeline and do some of this more abstract things would probably be difficult. And this is probably a good way of doing
I
it.
guess that's true, right?
But then you say in the future, you go, hey, I love what we did here. Next time, I'd like you to go gather this timeline before we get into the group.
Yeah.
So that we're,
You're right. We are seeing a team just kind of start to develop this postmortem culture. I like it's college football season right now, and so my mind is on football. And I, as an alumnus of the only 5-0 team in the Big 12, just like we all predicted. In case you don't follow college football at all, my alma mater, BYU, I think we're predicted to finish like 13 out of 16 in the conference, which like was a fair prediction. And for some reason, we're number one, so we're all pretty excited over here. Anyhow. But I think about that with football. Like my personal belief in football is like it's never the kicker's fault. Like sometimes you'll get to the point where it's like the team is down by 2, you have 1 play left in the game, so you bring out the field goal kicker, and they've got to make a kick from 40 yards away or something like that, and they'll miss, and people like to be like, oh my gosh, why couldn't they make the kick? I'm like, one, I cannot imagine a higher pressure scenario, right, than like having to kick the game-winning field goal. But I also say, 2, there was 60 minutes of game before this, right? Like, why didn't the defense stop their offense from getting more points on the board? Why didn't our offense get more points on the board? There were so many variables where you could have made it so that it doesn't come down to the game-winning field goal kick, right? And I feel that way with like incidents too, where like if you miss the database connection string, there is a whole like context in which you exist where you build that system that requires employees manually writing database connection strings, right? And that's part of the blameless postmortem is that idea of everyone did the best job with what they could have done. And I love this idea of like anytime something goes wrong, especially if it's human error, the first question you should ask yourself is like, why did they even have permission to do that? Like why or why do they have to do that? And then the answer is usually to build the system in such a way that you automate that away. But I mean, I always like to say, like, I love when a problem is my fault because it means I can fix it. Like if I have control over the problem,
right,
then we can get it done. But I have worked at places like that's such a great attitude at a lot of places, especially places with a good degree of psychological safety, right? If just raising your hand and saying, my bad, guys, I'm working on it, I'm going to fix it, right? At a lot of places, that's a real way to seem like a leader. That's a way to seem responsible. That's a way to, look like you're a team player. You do work at some places where saying, hey, that's my fault, like, and the hammer comes down, right? So, yeah, I mean, again, just all that to say, like psychological safety, like hugely important. And you can't have these really efficient processes like the blameless postmortem unless you have psychological safety.
Exactly. The other cool thing that came out of this was they were able to address the problem and fix it really quickly, right?
Absolutely.
So even though this thing did happen, it was not an ongoing problem. They were able to isolate it. And again, this was a testament to the tooling and the team that had gathered together. And the people who wrote the code did the troubleshooting and did the triage and did the fix, right? And that sounds novel, or doesn't even sound like a big deal to anybody who's working in a functional, like 2 pizza team. But compared to what we saw at Parts Unlimited in general, this easily could have been a multi-day outage, right?
Absolutely.
Because of the processes that had in place. Um, so this actually rounds out sort of towards the end of the chapter 13, which is section 2. And the cool ending piece to this I loved, which was, again, this gets back to value to the customer. Maxine has this unique opportunity where she gets to go do training
Oh
with
yeah.
training on site. And I thought this was a cool way to end this section because I think this always drives back to the customer value. Um, Maxine gets to go do training on site that apparently a lot of the executive leadership ends up doing and some other folks in the organization. But she's like at a Parts Unlimited physical retail store training to see what it's like as an employee to interact with their software systems, to interact with how they engage with customers. And again, she sees a bunch of dysfunction. I'd love to hear what you thought
No,
about the section.
I'm such a huge fan of this, and I will say that the awful little startup I worked at actually did do this, where there was a standard kind of orientation for uh, white collar office workers to kind of go see how the blue collar software is being implemented. This practice is famous at like a lot of places. Like for example, I know Disney, one, all employees have to do like this orientation thing called traditions. And like as part of traditions, you do actually go into the theme park, but it's more like you're part of like a tour guide where like and more experienced employees kind of pointing out like all of the things that kind of like make Disney Disney. But I do know that for like the executives will spend time as like in a character costume, like will be goofy for the day or at least for a couple hours. Uh, I wish more places did things like this. I worked for a food delivery company. I know that there was a sort of program to like be a driver for a bit, but like it wasn't mandatory by any means. Yeah, like I love when companies do this. I love when I've gotten the chance to do something like this in the past. Because like, yeah, I mean, there's no substitute for seeing how the people who use your software are actually using it.
Right. Right. Yeah. So anyway, I thought this was so valuable. And again, she's excited. She gets to like report back to her team and identifies more opportunities that this, what they're working on with Data Hub to enable the P&L focused team on these, SKUs and special promotions and these other things. She sees even more examples of exactly the type of problem it's going to solve in the retail stores, which is again is a very important part of their operations. And so this, this focus on the business mindedness of like, and we've talked about this in other episodes that what we've noticed in people who are like principal software engineers, or as we've moved up in our career, is that you have to understand how the business functions, right?
Absolutely.
Otherwise, you're just a feature factory, which is literally you're just going to build what people ask you to build. If you don't, in earlier in your career, that is kind of your job, right? Like you don't necessarily understand why you're doing certain things, but as you get more senior, you realize that like the way that you've been asked to build it or what you're being asked to build could be the wrong framing. It actually could be undermining the ability to serve the customer. And this idea, it gets back into clean coder, right? Which is like, what is a professional? How do you act professionally? And Maxine couldn't do her job unless she understood what problems they're really trying to solve at the end of the day. And so anyway, I thought that was a cool way to end section 2. It's it also leads up to this. I think what we're going to see in section 2, this is my my speculation, is that they actually start solving some of these big business problems, right? Like I think that they really get some credibility that comes out of it at the end and shows how engineering led organizations can really fundamentally shift what's possible, right?
Yeah, I think I'm excited to see how it plays out. Um, I always love when like a show or a movie or a book throws in like a weird off the wall twist. And there's just a part of me that's like, I hope Maxine's a vampire. Like, I hope that this completely shifts genres and becomes like a
Right.
horror novel. I don't think that's going to happen. I think Nathan's prediction is a lot more accurate as to how
They
this
all
book is
become
going to finish it.
zombies. They all become
Yeah,
zombies.
I know, right? Oh, it's going to be great. Well, so we've just finished part 2. We're going to wrap up part 3. But Nathan, any takeaways from part 2? Anything you want to do differently in your career as a result of it?
Yeah, so I just wrote in my notes, I wrote relentless optimism. This was actually like a direct quote. This was a reminder for Maxine to have this, and I think it is important. It's very easy for us to catastrophize or get frustrated, do these other things. And this relentless optimism, I think, is something that is important perspective to take if you're going to address dysfunction. Um, you may not be able to accomplish everything you want, but if with this, relentless optimism is infectious, it's contagious. And if you come to the table saying, look, we can impact change somehow. And so I hope as I find problems to solve that I'm also bringing relentless optimism with me. So it's just a good reminder.
Yeah. Something we're debating doing, and comment if this is something you're interested in. We're debating doing like almost like an accountability episode. Maybe that's like a bonus towards the end of the year where we go back through all of the things we've said we're going to do differently in our career and review, like, did we actually do those things and how did it turn out? Because last week I had said I kind of wanted to form a like-minded group that cuts across different teams, and I haven't quite gotten there yet, but I did kind of strike up a formally informal or informally formal, I don't know how you would say it, mentor relationship with a team, with an engineer on a different team. So I'm driving towards it. It's something I want to do. It's not necessarily something I'm going to implement right away, but I've just been reflecting on, I've been in this new role for about half a year now, and I got a promotion coming into this role, which was really cool. Um, but I wound up on a team with like 18 engineers, which is too many. And I was so concerned about kind of like, I have to have the proper amount of impact. I can't just work on little things. I need to be having big impact. And like, it led to a lot of analysis paralysis and not feeling like I could kind of corner one section of the project. So I'm like, if I can't find one section of the project where I'm in charge of it, then I shouldn't be doing it. But that's hard to do on a project where you're the new guy on the team and everyone else has a 3-year head start. If I could do it all over again, and when I wind up in this situation in the future where you come onto a team, especially in like a more senior role, and you'd be having good impact, I would do what Maxine did. I would just start taking as many tickets as possible. I tried to like strategize and like again, like analyze it too much. I should have just come in and taken as many grunt work tickets as possible and cranked them out, produced good code, shown that that's where I could add values by producing at a high level, even if it's these little tickets. And then by doing that, you come to understand the product and what the gaps are. So I admire that about Maxine, that despite, she could say, well, I used to run the MRP systems. I'm not going to come on here and data hub and just be any other old senior engineer. But yeah, just by her really, putting her shoulder to the wheel and taking on all these different tickets and working hard, she's been able to discover the bigger picture. And that's where she's really been able to lend value. So that's something I want to do better in the future. And I encourage our listeners to do that in the future. There's no substitute to just getting the work done. And then we always like to do recommendations. I mean, last week I said, it's a cautionary tale, and I'd recommend it to anyone who's only worked at one place or lots of the same kind of place. It's a good peek into the industry. I think this week I stay with that recommendation, but I also say I recommend to anyone who's interested in kind of that idea of like the classic Amazon 2 pizza team, like that all, work features should be able to be completely delivered by a team that can be fed by 2 pizzas. So that means about 8 people, right? This is a great example of what a 2 pizza team looks like, and in particular, how it functions in contrast to some of these more legacy organizations. So if you've ever been curious about what that looks like in practice, this is a great book for you. What about you, Nathan?
Yeah, my recommendation doesn't change, and I like your nuance. I think that is if I had thought a little more deeply about it, I would have stolen it. But yeah, again, this book is it's good because not only do they introduce these principles, but they give these like hypothetical scenarios on how you actually can use these tools to affect change, how you have to win over and be focused on the customer, winning over champions within different departments, how to build these smaller, scrappier teams. I still maintain that if you're working in a dysfunctional company and you feel like things are inefficient, this is immediately applicable. You're going to see glimpses of your company in this book, and there's real ways that you could try to affect change. I still maintain that this book is really fantastic for new CS grads or folks who, if you just finished coding school, you're trying to figure out like how you're going to navigate companies that you're in. This is really a great book so that you understand the lay of the land of what you could walk into. And so, I don't know. It's one of those where if you're in the tech industry, knowing this book exists, understanding the patterns it advocates, understanding why decisions are being made, it's just really useful. I would say that if anybody was on my team and we pinpointed, I saw this in the Unicorn Project, it would instantly give camaraderie. And so if you're looking for ways to connect to people in your organization and you show that you're going above and beyond, this is a great career development book. Just period.
Well, and absolutely. And, let's say you're a new grad and like you're fortunate enough that your first offer is like at Meta or Netflix, a place that's kind of really ahead of the time on like DevOps culture. This is still a great book because you understand where all those practices come from. It's kind of like, the fish doesn't know he's wet, right? And you kind of just think like, this is just how all software is delivered. But you find out, one, it's not how all software is delivered, but you also find out, why is this important? Why are all these practices? How did they come to be? And what does the alternative look like? And that's something we've talked about on this podcast, where in a lot of the books we read, we're not necessarily learning new information. I mean, we do learn tons on this podcast, but sometimes we'll read a book and we'll be like, oh yeah, that's not new information to me. I already understood this. But it's good to either, one, get a little more depth on the idea and maybe why that idea came to be. But also, even if you have the proper amount of depth already, just getting that validation and saying, okay, yeah, this is other smart folks agree with me on this idea, and I feel a little more confident in my beliefs now. So this is a great one for you too, even if you haven't worked at like kind of a legacy place like this. But yeah, Unicorn Project, excellent read. We're going to finish up our discussion of it next week. Let us know in the comments kind of how you feel about the pace. We're liking the pace of this one so far. It's divided nice and cleanly into 3 parts. We feel like we may get a lot of good discussion out of it. Let us know in the comments what you think. And you can always leave a comment. You make sure to like, comment, subscribe if you're on YouTube. If you are listening on an audio platform, give us a 5-star review. You can contact us on Twitter. We're at Book Overflow Pod. YouTube, that's what we are too. You can check out our reading schedule at www.bookoverflow.io. You can contact us at contact@bookoverflow.io. You can find me on Twitter at Carter Morgan. And you can find Nathan and all of his work with his Functionally Imperative newsletter and links to his YouTube channels where he does fascinating interviews with fascinating folks at www.functionallyimperative.com. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. We've been having a blast with the podcast, been having a blast with the Unicorn Project, and we're excited to bring you the final part of our discussion next week. But until then, see you later, folks.